Welcome everyone, this is Sophie Wispren of the Doing Business and Doing Good Summit. How to use your business to create a better world. I'm very happy to have here with us today Jerr Boschee. He's one of the founding fathers of the Movement for Social Enterprise and the CEO and founder of the Institute for Social Entrepreneurs. I'm very happy to have him here with us today. Welcome, Jerr.
Hi there, Sophie. How are you today?
All right. So you have been advising for over 35 years social entrepreneurs how to be successful.
Right.
What shaped you to become the leader in the movement for social entrepreneurs that you are today?
Well, it took a while because that clearly was a field that did not exist when I was in college. I was a journalist for 11 years. But what really began to change my life's plan happened in 1967, 50 years ago now. I was 22, and I went to Europe for the first time. And the first place I went to, where I landed, was Munich. And the next day I found myself at Dachau. And I learned the meaning of evil when I walked into that place. And it shook me up. I was a white bread kid from suburban Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I knew about these things and thought they were terrible, but they'd never been viscerally part of my life. 2 weeks later, I was at the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam. Same kind of reaction. Following spring, I joined the Peace Corps, in part because of these experiences. I went to India for 2 years, lived in a village in India. Learned that the people there wanted the same things for their children that the people back in my home state of Minnesota wanted for their children. Learned many other things as well, made good friends. Went back to being a journalist for a while, and then worked for a nonprofit that helped people who were physically challenged for a year or two. And then I heard about this guy at Control Data Corporation, one of the Fortune 100 companies at the time, who was using computer technology to address social needs as businesses, not as philanthropic activity. Make a long story short, through a series of circumstances, I wound up becoming the chief communications aide for him and the general manager for all of the corporation's public relations and advertising activities. And eventually from there, with some other corporations and some other individuals, we started what became eventually the National Center for Social Entrepreneurs. I was there for 16 years. The last 8 were as CEO. And in 1999, I left, and I've been on my own ever since through my institute. And what drives me, what my passion has been, has changed as I've gotten older, because as a younger man, I was more of an idealist, and I wanted to, as some people say, change the world in 45 minutes. And I've become much more of an incrementalist over time, but my fundamental passion has not changed. And that's to make a difference for individuals. For the world, yes. For society as a whole, yes. But for individual people, one by one, if at all possible. And that's why I'm spending my 60s and 70s teaching graduate students who are attempting to start their own social enterprises and to help them, because they will help others. I spent almost my entire career way back upstream trying to give people a sense of what this is all about, and leaving it to others to help them walk through this process of doing it. And the same is true with my students. I help them develop business plans and fast pitches, and we spend 7 months together, and then they're off into the world. And I try to do that. That's what I do today. And I do it all the way from elementary school through graduate school with students.
Wow, that is amazing. And could you, because you were with quite some others into the early days of social entrepreneurship, could you shed a light on how that started and how did it become to be called social entrepreneurship?
Mm-hmm. First, we have to make a distinction between the people who are the practitioners, who are actually being social entrepreneurs, and there were those who were helping to build the ecosystem for social entrepreneurs, helping to shape the environment and telling the stories. I've been pretty much in that second category, although during my 8 years running the National Center, we were a social enterprise during that period of time as well. Perhaps the very first person who talked about this sort of thing publicly and had a website. Well, it couldn't have had a website. It was too early. There were no websites. But he had ways to communicate. It was a fellow named Ed Skloot, Skloot. And he ran something, I think, called New Ventures, Inc. back in the late 70s. Our organization, which went under a series of names but became the National Center for Social Entrepreneurs, was the second organization. And we used to say, wouldn't it be wonderful if someday there were 30 or 50 or 100 organizations like ours and like Ed's? And gradually over time, other individuals began building the ecosystem. And more of the practitioners felt less and less like they were alone. And in 1998, 6 of us basically threw our Rolodexes on the table, and nobody today I know knows what a Rolodex is, but we had lots of names. And we invited everybody we could, and we staged the first national gathering for social entrepreneurs in 98. By 2001, the Global Business Network was suggesting that social entrepreneurship might be the most important thing to come out of the business world in the first half of this century. And along about 2008 or 9, the industry really exploded. In 2008, I did a history of the industry up to that point, and I meant to, update it every year, but it got out of control. It just blew up into a much more sizable thing.
What would you say is the percentage of social enterprises as part of the total business world?
As part of the total business world?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, much less than 1%.
Okay. But part of the entrepreneurial business world?
It's not much higher. It's growing slowly. I mean, we have to understand the difference between being a social innovator and actually starting a business as a social enterprise.
So maybe you can tap into the definition. How would you define the social entrepreneur?
Well, that's social innovators find new routes to old destinations using whatever is at hand, but they don't start businesses. They don't start enterprises, okay? And I wrote a book about this in 2006. At a certain point, the social innovator who does wonderful things and has kept his nonprofit going or his organization going as long as he can, hits a wall, and it can't get any further unless they start generating earned revenue. If they generate enough earned revenue, it can actually become net profit out of the social enterprise. Now, the social enterprise, one of two kinds. It either employs people who are otherwise unseen, people who are physically challenged, people who've been formerly in prison, former prostitutes, women living in cold water flats with 3 kids, people who are autistic, whatever. If you go back 20, 30 years, none of those people were on the radar screen. Or it creates a product or a service that directly addresses a social need rather than simply starting a philanthropic foundation out of your widget manufacturing company. So you might be doing a wheelchair repair business, okay? Or you might be doing some kind of a hospice care business or a charter school, something that directly addresses the social need. And there are some that do both. They employ a target population and they deliver a product or service. Now, those are the social enterprises. The social innovators are much more, there are many more of them. And it's very rare that they can also become the enterpriser. Because if there's one subject that has really resonated with my audiences, and as you know, I've spoken in more than 20 countries and more than 40 states here in the US over the years, is when I talk about there being 3 types of leaders: the innovator, the entrepreneur, and the professional manager. And companies typically grow through those 3 stages. And it's rare that one person has more than one of those sets of skills. From the outside looking in, the innovator and the entrepreneur look a lot alike, but from the inside looking out, they're very different, and research has shown that repeatedly. So the innovators, when they hit that wall, have a real challenge. They either have to find an entrepreneur, a genuine one, and hire that person as the chief operating officer, and then get out of that person's way, or they have to leave, and the organization has to hire a true entrepreneur to take it to the next stage. Okay. Professional manager comes further down the road after the entrepreneur has a going concern.
So you're saying you have seen the movement growing. If you read the articles and read the news, it seems the social entrepreneurship movement and social enterprises is accelerating nowadays. Why would you say nowadays it is accelerating versus like 30 years ago?
It's a good question. Just a few years ago, there weren't even any courses in any universities about this subject. Now, even I think it's Fortune magazine or Forbes magazine actually publishes an annual list of the universities that have the best programs in social entrepreneurship. So the academics are coming in. In the UK, the government came in about 20 years ago and began facilitating the growth over there. In the US, that didn't start until about 2010 or 11. It still isn't very much. There's also some new legal structures that have helped a little bit, like the B Corps that you and I have talked about in the past.
Yeah.
But for the most part, there's a new generation that's come along that believes in doing something that's meaningful socially. And they found a new tool, and that's to take the best out of the old nonprofit way of doing things and the best out of the old corporate way or private sector or small business way of doing things and putting them together and running a business that does both. It has a social mission and it becomes profitable and supports itself sustainably.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's becoming very appealing to the millennials and the group that's following behind. And certainly with the students I see and the young people in the junior highs and the high schools, undergraduates, all the way through.
Exactly. So combinations of the issues getting bigger, the millennials, and I mean across generations, there is more interest into embracing a social mission, and the ecosystems are there, and of course the speed of the internet.
Well, yes, there's just so many more tools available for people to even become aware of the movement. That was one of the original challenges, to get enough people to be aware of this, because people like Ed Skloot and I and a bunch of others, we started long before the internet arrived. But once that certainly did make a difference, and now you have podcasts and many websites and lots of information that can be shared with the snap of the finger.
And why is it that your assessment at this moment is that it is only 1%?
At the most. I mean, there's so many businesses in the world, and when we're talking about social enterprises, it almost always has to be something that has begun as a social enterprise, either coming out of a nonprofit or coming out of an individual's heart and soul. Most of the stuff that corporations are doing and calling social entrepreneurship, very little of that is actually starting a business that has a product that addresses a social need or employs a target population. They may be facilitating some of that through their foundations. They may be doing some wonderfully socially innovative things through their own businesses, but it's not the same thing as a social enterprise, which is a freestanding business.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, your definition of a social enterprise is like a B Corp. It is an enterprise that has a social mission integrated in the core of the business and holds all its stakeholders accountable for that.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that every social enterprise could become a B Corp, but that not all B Corps are social enterprises.
So what is then your definition of a social entrepreneur and your definition of a social enterprise?
Well, a social entrepreneur, I think, fundamentally has to be somebody who is equally concerned with mission and money.
Yeah.
And they have to maintain a balance. Dr. David Rendell refers to social entrepreneurs, enterprise people, as tightrope walkers, because they're balancing between these two all the time. And sometimes you have to pay more attention to the mission, and sometimes you have to pay more attention to the money, and both of those activities will make somebody mad. But the entrepreneur has to keep them in balance in his or her heart and in his or her business activities. So I'm talking about a social enterprise person. A social entrepreneur who's an innovator doesn't necessarily have to maintain that same kind of balance. The innovator's job is to work out prototypes and get the kinks out of them, and then hope some entrepreneur can take it and turn it into a going concern. What was the second half of the question?
And what is your definition of a social enterprise?
Well, a social enterprise is a business that has both mission and money at its heart. Social enterprise, ultimately, if it's sustainable, it's just like any other business. It's bringing in more money than it's spending.
Yeah.
And it's bringing it in from the sale of products or services that directly address a social need, or by employing more than 50% of its line employees from a target population and making a profit off whatever it sells. It could be a widget, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's got to be one of those two, or both.
So actually, I mean, nowadays, one could say every business should embrace a issue and embrace to have a social mission. What would you say about that? So
Well,
actually,
I think it's true that every business, every person should have a social mission, whether it's a personal one or a business one. How that mission is carried out, though, would be very different in the private sector and in the nonprofit sector and in the public sector and by individuals.
I also hear a lot of enterprises say, okay, I mean, they have an enterprise, it is going well, but they need a next investment level to grow. And it is hard to find still
Yes,
investors that want to
yes,
invest in social enterprises. So
right.
what would your advice be for these social enterprises?
Well, you've already described the situation. It's hard to find these people, but there are more and more foundations and both corporate and independent foundations that are setting aside some of their money to help invest in, not just fund, but invest in social enterprises. There are individuals out there, especially the newer breed of social investors. I have another document I could send you if you wanted to share with other people, talking about the differences traditionally between the traditional investor, the traditional social investor, and the current types of social investors. They have different priorities, but there are individuals out there who do this. We're also seeing that there are funds being created out of whole cloth to try to service this particular industry. But one of their problems is difficulty finding social enterprises that are worth investing in yet.
Okay.
There's the early stage money is a little bit easier to get. You know, the $25,000 to develop the prototype and get something developed. It's the working capital that's always been the difficult one to get.
Okay.
And we're not there yet, but there's more out there than there used to be. And again, as I said earlier, one of the defining characteristics of a social entrepreneur is always believing that the money's out there and that we'll find it.
And would you have any advice for social entrepreneurs on where to look and where to find?
Go to talk to everybody you can think about, that you can think of. Go to every event you can think about. Every person you talk to, ask them for the names of 2 other people you can talk to. Then go talk to those 2 people, get 2 more names from each of them, and just keep going. And every time you talk to them, learn something. And if you get turned down from an actual ask them why and what you could do to improve it. It's a constant door knocking, being told no, being told no, being told no, until something finally happens.
And do you have any examples of social entrepreneurs that made it to the next level? So not in the startup phase, but in the next level to
most of the organizations that I have been familiar with over the years did not really go through that process. They just went through their own gradual, slow growth to become much larger than their startups. So Minnesota Diversified Industries went from $100 to almost $70 million, all through earned revenue, employing people who are developmentally disabled. But it was a 30-year process to get there. The Housing Works in New York really built its growth on chutzpah, because nobody would hire people who had AIDS and were dying. They did. They started their own business to do it, and they went on from there to do a lot of other things. Delancey Street Foundation out in San Francisco, working with ex-prisoners and former addicts and former prostitutes and treating them as their only employees. So they had to step up and do these things. Educational Services of America decided that, hey, autistic kids have talent and they should be given the opportunity to have the best education possible. So they bought into that. Cooperative Home Care Associates recognized that African American women living in the South Bronx of New York had talents and could build on them. Part of making these things grow is putting on new lenses and looking at things in different ways and looking at these target populations in different ways. To actually get the money to grow further, you've got to have a killer management team. I mean, that's what investors will look at in any field. You've got to have basic math that shows eventually they might get their money back, even if that's all they want is to get it back so they can invest it somewhere else like Tiva does. And you've got to have a business plan. At least we know business plans change every day, but at least you have to start knowing who you are so you can explain yourself to somebody else. I'm rambling a bit in terms of your question, but it sort of overwhelms me.
What are other pitfalls or challenges of social entrepreneurs that you faced over the years?
Well, almost anything you can think of is going to trip people up. Personnel issues. Mm-hmm. Clearly, if you don't have the right team, either they don't have the skills or they don't work well together. If you have a flawed business plan, if your core concept of what you're selling and to whom you're selling it and for what purpose is flawed, if you confuse a mission with a vision and that garbles your story, if your long-term goals are unrealistic when you try to show them to an investor, if you don't measure your outcomes, not your inputs or the rest or your output, but your outcomes, if you do the wrong kind of branding because you picked the wrong market slice to go after or just don't know how to do branding, if you neglect the details in an operations plan, I mean, I can just go on. Any one of these things can doom a company. Yeah. And that's why these things are so difficult to do.
And what do you teach social entrepreneurs when they're with you for 7 months in the institute?
The people I have do not come with business degrees for the most part. They come from having worked in the nonprofit sector or worked in corporations. My graduate students are age from about 23 to 55. And they spend 5 semesters getting a master's degree, and I teach the capstone course the last 2 semesters. And we literally start by getting them to focus on one thing, and then we develop a business plan. It takes 7 months of building blocks. We start with the feasibility study. Then we have them develop the core concept, then a navigation system, mission, vision, core values, and the rest. Then we do a market analysis, and then we do an operations plan, and then we do a marketing plan, and then we do a cash flow projections, and develop the key management team. We do all those pieces, and then we teach them how to do an oral presentation. So by the end of the year, they have a business plan that goes into a competition, and they have a fast pitch presentation that they deliver in front of about 200 people, and both of them have cash awards and that sort of thing. So it's a laborious but fun process because it becomes something they can get their hands and hearts around rather than everything all at once. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. That's what I used to do with nonprofits. I don't do consulting anymore. I do some coaching, and usually it's over Skype or telephone or something just for a half an hour. And that's all pro bono work. But what I can't do with them is take them through a process. I can just address their particular issue. What
would you, if you could pick like a couple of strategies and tips to be a successful entrepreneur, successful social entrepreneur, what would this be?
Well, I think one of them is what we discussed earlier. Just focus on one thing. Yeah. Figure out that one thing is where you can be world class, and trust that somebody else will come along and do the other things you wanted to accomplish and become world class if they do them well. You're all seeking the same vision, but you've got different missions to get there. Mm-hmm. And rather than you trying to do all the missions to get there, just pick the one that you're the best at and nail that and just go for that one. Secondly, in terms of the management style, as you build your team and you build your company, lead from the rear. Hire people who are smarter than you are. Give them the freedom to make decisions on the street level. They don't have to check back with you, check back with the board of directors, check back with the stockholders or the stakeholders. Trust your people, pick the right people. But probably the single most important thing that I tell all my students, all my audiences around the world, is don't quit until the miracle happens. You've just got to believe it's going to happen. Don't quit, because it's going to be very hard not to quit. Mm-hmm. And what you have to understand is that you have to have somewhere inside yourself that you can go to replenish yourself, because you're going to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning some mornings, and if not be despairing about it, be terribly, terribly depressed about what's been happening with the business and what the opportunities are and all the no's you've been getting. But you have to remember that if you quit now, it's over.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't quit, I guarantee the miracle's going to happen. I don't know what the miracle is going to look like. It may not look like the thing you're talking about, but like that student I told you about a few moments ago in South Africa, the miracle is happening. And I've gotten 3 or 4 emails in the last couple months from former students where the miracle has started to happen from students I taught 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So don't quit until the miracle happens.
Okay, those are good tips. Thanks for sharing. So back to where we are now. What do you think is needed to improve the business world to be a force for good and embrace the mindset of a social entrepreneur?
Well, I think you have to get champions who are CEOs of major corporations to take it seriously, which is something my boss at Control Data did back there in the late 70s and early 80s, Bill Norris. He was the man who really defined what a social enterprise is. We weren't calling it that, a social enterprise then. And he went around the world preaching the gospel. And I traveled with him as his communications chief, talking to CEOs, talking to the media all over the world. And it's the same thing today. If you can get enough CEOs out there to truly understand what social entrepreneurship is and then work together, it's like having well, I'm not even going to get into the politics of what's going on in the United States right now. But we did have some industry councils, and they all disbanded in the last week or so because of the differences with the government. But bringing together an advisory group of CEOs across the world, across the United States, across one state. It's happening here in Illinois. There is a state social enterprise council.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we need to do. Is we need to get top down as well as bottom up interest in getting this done. But who pulls the strings of power? These days, it's still the top down. So until we get people up there to really, and I chose those words carefully, really understand what social entrepreneurship is, not just use it as a buzzword, it's going to be difficult.
It's an educational challenge. And I mean, of course, we can wait for the next generation or next generations to embrace that, but we might need to accelerate on that.
Well, and it's what it is. It's with any movement, you have to build awareness first, and then you build understanding, both of what you're saying and what you're not saying.
Yeah.
And then if they'll decide whether you have any credibility.
Mm-hmm.
First 2 you can accomplish if you're kind of skillful at it, but the third one, they make the decision. And then the 4th stage is always there will be other equally credible arguments, but which one will be most persuasive? And that's the 4th stage. So we have to start with the awareness and continue to build it. And people are doing that. People like Robert Rootstein is doing that with TBLI. People are doing it in the social enterprise in the UK with their magazines and their conferences. Social Enterprise Coalition, I couldn't remember the word at the moment. The Social Enterprise Alliance here in the United States, the Canadian group, the name escapes me at the moment, but but it's still happening. It's still not happening in the private sector.
So, I mean, there are social entrepreneurs out there. There are also the so-called social entrepreneurs that are, I mean, creating shared value or, I mean, having similar mindset and approaches as social entrepreneurs outside bigger corporations.
Yeah, I'm a little, I think that's fine too. I've tended to be kind of doubtful about use of the phrase intrapreneur, because again, an entrepreneur is based on earned revenue. And if they are in fact starting a new division within a corporation with a new product, doing it within a larger corporation, then intrapreneur works for me. Yeah. But if they're just shifting the things around on a table organizational chart, that's innovation perhaps, but not entrepreneurship.
All right. And what would be your tip for leaders out there, be it in social enterprises or any leader in an organization that want to create a better world? What would your tip be to be a force for good?
I think it's by mentoring at least one other person who is going to do something that's a force for social good, somebody who has a good idea. The person can be older than you are, it doesn't matter. But if each one of us can help one other person, and that person can help, I believe in the ripple effect of everything that we do. And it's one of the reasons I'm now a teacher. I didn't intend to become a college teacher. I've only been doing this for the last 8 or 10 years. But it's a powerful way at this stage in my life to work with a dozen to 20 of these individuals at a time. And each of those is going to inspire other people. Yeah. And some of the projects that have come out of it have been very inspiring to other people already. So I think the way we get there, whether you're in the private sector, the nonprofit sector, the social enterprise sector, the government, or any of the rest, is you personalize it. And you really reach out to help. And maybe you get some sort of social group in your local community of social enterprisers and invite in people who are interested and have ideas and just sort of pair up. However you do it. Maybe it's somebody already in your own organization and you want to help them move out and start their own thing. But each of us help somebody else do it. And it'll multiply.
So a matchmaking between...
Yeah, it's informal, but yeah, because we each do it ourselves. The matchmaking, every time we try to formalize things, they just sort of, it's not as powerful as when a person just decides to do it on his or her own and goes and does it and says, that person's got something, I want to help that person. People love to help people. And if you're that person out there, you need to learn how to ask this person for help.
Yeah.
This person needs to be ready and needs to be able to spot them and be willing to do it. It's all.
You once wrote in an article, I read it, that you think the social entrepreneurship movement will become mainstream. When do you think that will become mainstream, and what does mainstream mean for you?
Oh boy. I think I was quoting the Global Business Network when I wrote that. Mainstream, I think in my current definition, because I am still an incrementalist, is that it is beginning to creep into every arena of social need, rather than just being in the easy ones. They're not easy, any of them, but there are some that are easier than others, like education is a little bit easier than working with people who are living with HIV was 25 years ago, for example. But I think mainstream today is what you're seeing from the question you asked much earlier in the conversation. It's being written about, it's being talked about, it's being taught in universities and in high schools, graduate schools. There are more competitions. There are more investment formats coming out. Stuff is beginning to happen, is seeping in to people's consciousness. Now, I don't know where there is a tipping point where you can say, oh, it's mainstream, but it is clearly more than it was 35 years, almost 40 years ago when I first started doing this stuff.
But it is still early days if you see it as part of the global context.
I do. Yeah. I do see it still the early days, but you know, it's like there's an acceleration in it, and there will be a point where the acceleration accelerates. Yeah. Unless we blow ourselves up. I mean, that's...
Okay, I don't hope so. All right. You also have a free gift to share with the audience. Could you share what it is?
Yeah, from 2011 to 2015, I wrote a monthly blog entry, quite lengthy, about sometimes as much as 1,500 words, sometimes as little as 750 words. And last year I put them all into a book. There's 44 of them, and it can be downloaded for free from my website. It's called Jerr's Journal, My Adventures in Social Enterprise. And you just go to the website, which I'm sure you'll provide to them, and click on the cover of the book, and you can download it in one of 4 different formats. And I just checked today, it's been downloaded in 137 countries now, and it's being circulated. It just continues to flow. It's been out there for about 15 months now, and been downloaded thousands of times. So.
Yeah, it provides a lot of interesting stories. I'm sure the audience finds it very useful.
Good.
Thanks a lot, Jerr, for all the insights and your experience and the tips for the audience to embrace social entrepreneurship.
Thank you for making me part of this, and good luck with the summit.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jerr.
Take care.